Welcome to Believing the Real, a series of talks on the theology of the real. In this episode, chapter 16 of our theology of the real, we will continue our discussion of the embodied trust represented by money and the way in which paper currency evolved over time. This time we will discuss the distrust of paper currency and how the blight of materiality still hovers over this young innovation of money as people cling to the gold, as it were, up to the First World War, and the mentality of clinging to the gold which still persists. Hello. Welcome to another episode of Believing the Real. This is chapter 16, and we're going to continue discussing the history of money within the context of the Tisvurium, this neologism that I've coined. Actually, it's not a neologism, it's just an abbreviation of the inter-subjective world of others represented in our minds, of which money is the most tangible manifestation. Okay, so it's money, it's manifestation, which is really a manifestation. I'm going to write this down. And this manifestation of trust between people is so tangible that it in fact overcomes the entire world. It becomes the basis of our world, of the interchange between people. And because money has such deep consensual value, it is hard to grasp the intangibility of it, which seems counterintuitive. We can't think of money as something so abstract as just trust between people that something is of value. And that's why people cling to the gold, as it were, or bite the gold. They invent crypto-currencies and things that could make things that could make this intangible more tangible, because it's kind of a paradox that something so abstract could be so forcefully tangible by being trusted by everyone. This is the main issue here, that trust between people, the common belief, the intersubjective world of others represented in our minds, the fact that everyone is sharing the same world, the same value world, is so strong that we can talk about people of low morality that would sell their own mothers for money and so on. And of course, money is always perceived as something very concrete. The actual coins, the actual gold, the actual bills, and so on and so forth. When in fact, it is in fact just in our minds. Okay, so this is very clearly seen in a passage brought by Jack Weatherford in his book, The History of Money, a passage from Faust, where the intangibility of money is perceived as something immoral, as something problematic. How could this be a figment of our imagination? This is the devil's work. So let's have a look at that. So here we are, quoting Jack Weatherford, who is describing Goethe's Faust. So he writes the following. It's on page 138 in his book. Faust comes home to the emperor's carnival ball, dressed appropriately as Plutus, the god of wealth. And through magic, he and Mephistopheles show the emperor the riches he can have by printing money. So in that century, gold was still not only the standard, it was actual coins that were considered money. It was very tangible. And they convinced the emperor to sign a note bearing the inscription, "To whom it may concern, Be by these presents known, this note is legal tender for 1,000 crowns and is secured by the immense reserves of wealth safely stored underground in our imperial states. Okay, he has based the value of his money on the future mining of gold, the untapped treasures still buried in the earth. By the next morning, the emperor has forgotten that he signed the note, but during the night, Mephistopheles has had thousands of copies of it made in various denominations. The new money has been unleashed to the great joy of creditors, debtors, soldiers, and other citizens. Already people are ordering new clothes, and business booms from the butcher and baker. Wine is flowing freely in the taverns, and even the dice roll more easily. Priests and prostitutes scurry about their business with greater enthusiasm because of the new money, and even the moneylenders are enjoying a brisk business. And people value this the same as honest gold? Asks the incredulous emperor. The court and army take it as full pay. Much as I find it strange, I see I must accept it. Indeed, because there is no honest gold. No gold is honest. Because all gold is just a representation of the same thing as the paper money presents. And quite the contrary, while gold may be limited in quantity based on the way it is quarried and who quarries it and who mines it, money in paper form is unlimited. And being unlimited, it can really move the entire economy forward, being incredibly creative, being incredibly supportive of creativity in all walks of life. So it's like putting blood into the market, bringing the economy flood of new life through this paper money. But because it is so difficult to grasp this concept that money is so abstract and yet so strong for us, then it seems that it is the devil's work, like a magic, and it actually works. Even to this day, most of the gold, or a lot of the gold in the world, I think like a quarter of all the gold ever mined in the world is somewhere in the basement of Fort Knox, or the federal, somewhere in the basements of the federal government. There's this, I think he describes it later on, Weatherford, the great mass of gold, which is just lying there, it's just part of the of the economy, but it's not an active part because you don't really need it, because everything is indeed in the common mind, in the intersubjective mind of people. So in fact, we see that money and paper money is another step in the move towards money as an abstraction, something that we are still, a process that we are still in the midst of, as I will discuss later on when we get to the Great Recession from 2008 and on, and what steps governments have taken to combat that recession. But the thing is that the blight of materiality still hovers over this young innovation of money spread throughout the human universe, not just money between when conducting business between commercial travelers, merchants, bankers, etc., but money for all, money that floods into the economy at all levels, at all denominations, and is accessible for negotiations, for interactions between all people on planet Earth. So this innovation is being hounded all the time with the blight of materiality, with the actual material possessions that we saw, that the way that it began its path as a commodity, and then the gold, and now money, but money at first attached to gold, and when it's not attached to gold, we will see to what else it is attached, and how even today there are collaterals. There are certain aspects of the money market, of the money economy, that people consider more tangible. But this materiality, this tangibility, is like a blight that hovers over this amazing innovation of the tesurium. Because in our intersubjective world, still we try all the time to connect things to a standard. So in the past, it was trying to connect it the money, even though people were printing money, but they connected it to silver or to gold. In fact, there was a great struggle for many years over bimetallism. Because gold was the main standard, and in the US, many people wanted more money in the economy, and they thought that the only way to get it was to put silver in. So they had this huge fight over bimetallism. We will see it later on in Jack Weatherford's book, and he has this amazing new take on the Wizard of Oz as a kind of comment on this struggle of trying to get bimetallism into the market. But the important issue here is that this tangibility, this seeking always to return money to some material thing, has been a blight on the development of the market to this very day, because money seems to people less trustworthy as they lose as it moves away from tangibility. So, for example, in the American war, it was a loss of trust in the ability of Congress to cover the paper money. And the question is, where does this start? Where does this slow slide into distrust begin? It's like there's something that people continue to trust all the time, and some things that they begin trusting and then they lose trust in. So it's like the more prudent people, prudent in parentheses, in brackets, the more prudent people, the more those more drawn to materiality, those who want to see the gold may be those who are bringing the market down, because they are always there to distrust the money. Where does distrust start from? I don't know yet. I'm going to research this more in depth, but there is some point. Someone's beginning to say, this isn't wrong. This is wrong. I'm sure there are people who are naysayers who say, no, we're not going to trust this money anymore. So where does it start? When does the market, when does everybody use money and feel great about it, and everything is coming up and everyone trusts the money and the economy is booming, like perhaps most of the 19th century under the gold standard of Britain? And when do people begin to distrust the money and say, no, we don't want this money, we want something more tangible? So the trust and distrust, this play around money, what is the core of trust? Which today with fiat currencies, the core of trust is actually national governments. And this also is problematic. For part of the crisis, we will see later on, part of the 2008 crisis was they stopped believing in, for example, Belgium. Those who rate governments gave Belgium, for example, and I think another European government, they took down their grading, their rating, their credit rating. And since certain bonds were relying on that government, then suddenly distrust entered the market, and things went from bad to worse and began deteriorating. So where is this switch? Where do we stop trusting in a currency? Where does it begin, this conflagration that brings about a recession? This has been haunting economies of man from the beginning, because trust is so fragile. And the very people who are the most frugal and steadfast, the hard-headed, are the first, in fact, to spread the panic, the first to point to the nakedness of the king, to demand better collaterals, better safeguards. But these very safeguards are also imaginary elements of the system. For what is the safeguard? Okay, so you want everything backed by gold, for example. But gold itself, who says it's of value? Gold, we know now it's a commodity that fluctuates like any other commodity. So there is actually nothing to trust but trust. So those distrusting people who seem to be most hard-headed and most steadfast economical heads are in fact those who break the market, who destroy the trust for everyone else by doubting something that needs trust, not that needs trust, that is trust, that is embodied trust. So actually what destroys markets and brings recessions are the non-believers, the heathens, the heretics of the market, are the breakers of the market. So everything hinges actually on a consensus, on a majority acceptance that this is money, that this works fine. And most of the market today functions quite well with cash. It's only the derivatives that are giving us problems. But what are the problems of derivatives? That we will discuss in future in the next talks as we continue our analysis of money. But the important here is that this problem of those of distrust generated by the people who are to be actually in charge of the monetary systems and are supposed to be the most conservative, the most risk averse, in fact, in their very risk aversion, may be those creating the collapse of markets. So we can see, and we will see this, that in attempts to heal the system are always in that direction. For example, now, part of the attempts to heal the system is to set up clearinghouses for derivatives so that there will be a central authority that will make sure that derivatives have enough backing, enough liquidity, and not be too much based on too much trust, as it were. But the liquidity itself is a function of trust. So there's actually, it's like creating pools of trust on the basis of distrust. And that distrust is corrosive to the market. So, in fact, when you provide or attempt to provide more and more liquidity, more and more collateral to support the system of trust, then you have a problem, because the core itself, the core of the liquidity itself is based on trust, or what they call backed by the full authority and confidence of the US government. So you have to believe in the US government that will back its what? Its money. But what is that money if not embodied trust? Anyway, I'm going around in circles and saying this again and again from different directions, or maybe even the same direction, because it's so counterintuitive. It's like so difficult to step away from our tendency to view the foundations of money, the underlying collaterals, as it were, the liquidity, as something more tangible than other forms of money, the derivatives and so on. But in fact, it's the same intangibility all the way. It's intangible throughout the system, because throughout the system, it's all embodied trust. So how, in fact, did the embodied trust of a money economy evolve? So if we go back to our study of the history of money, then we see, quoting again from Jack Weatherford, this is on page 158, we see that throughout most of the 18th century, the Bank of England issued banknotes in 10 and 20 pound denominations. Already money, paper money was being distributed, but at that time, a 20-pound note had the purchasing power of roughly 1,000 modern dollars. And because of their great value, the notes were used exclusively in large business transactions, particularly those among the financiers and rich merchants within the city of London. For most people, coins of much smaller value usually sufficed for daily transactions. So paper money was relegated to the big transactions. And while the regular people or other people, the people on the street, were relegated to exchanging coins, the tangible held variety of money. But this made money more like the exclusive domain of the rich. It didn't spread out. This embodied trust did not percolate yet to the whole population. But during the financial crisis provoked by the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century, the bank began issuing 1 and 2 pound notes to compensate for the shortage of coins. Because coins, you have to mine the ore to make the coin. So where will you hinge your embodied trust if there's not enough metal? So you have to hinge it on something more available, paper. So war, that great catalyst of economic development, caused the bank to issue smaller notes to compensate for the shortage of coins and to expand the supply of money needed to purchase materials and pay the soldiers. Even a 1 pound note, however, represented a relatively large amount of money, equivalent to about 50 modern dollars, and it would not have been used by an average person in the course of a normal day's transactions. So we see that this is an evolving matter. The availability of money to all, the percolation of this trust into the entire population is something that took time. Weatherford writes that in Scotland, they returned the right to issue monetary notes, but even they were required to back their currency offerings with notes issued by the Bank of England. The Bank of England, in turn, had to guarantee the convertibility of all its paper notes into gold on demand, thus making a paper pound just as valuable as a gold one. So you see that we see the emergence of money, we see the emergence of paper, of this which makes the abstraction that money is more transparent for us. It's much easier for us to perceive how intangible money is when there is something less tangible, notes. But these are still backed by the great collateral of gold, a tangibility that masks for us the actual intangibility of everything to do with money. In any case, money becomes more intangible and more available to all, while that pyramid of seeking the tangible still persists. There's still a pot of gold at the end of the money rainbow. So in fact, this evolution of money into greater and greater intangibility took a very long time, and people were very much attached to their collaterals. And the great system of the 19th century all operated on the backing of gold. And this was also a very strong institution of trust. So I'm reading from Weatherford. Again, it's on page 159. During the 19th century, the Bank of England became the focal and stabilizing institution of the world monetary and banking system. As John Kenneth Galbraith wrote of the Bank of England, of all institutions concerned with economics, none has for so long enjoyed such prestige. It is, in all respects, to money as St. Peter's is to the faith, and the reputation is deserved, for most of the art as well as of the mystery associated with the management of money originated there. So, in fact, we have here also the rise of institutions as the focal point of trust. Because what did people trust when they exchanged banknotes in the 19th century? They trusted the Bank of England. They trusted that institution, that whosoever should approach it with that banknote will receive its worth, its quoted worth in tangibles, in gold. So, in fact, though few ever came to the Bank of England to demand their pound of flesh, their pot of gold, the belief, the trust in the notes was sustained by the trust in that estimable institution in Britain. Most of the world, writes Weatherford, operated on a gold standard, but a few countries, including Mexico and China, continued on a silver standard. Despite variations in the prices of the two metals and some difficulties in synchronizing the two, they essentially functioned as part of a single world money system in which all currencies had the backing of either gold or silver. So local currencies still persisted in using the metals, and the metals were what people actually trusted, as if the metals themselves were in some way of true value. So the metals, though, served to focus people's trust. The institution of public trust, this intersubjective consensus about the value of money, centered on the metals. The Bank of England, however, which is the prototype actually of what's going to be the sovereign that dictates the value of money, the Bank of England, I'm reading from Weatherford, became the prototype of the centralized national bank, emulated by national banks around the world. The era from the beginning of Queen Victoria's reign until the outbreak of World War I was one of the most stable periods in money history, and it produced the greatest general prosperity known in history to that time. Under the leadership of the Bank of England, the world operated on a single monetary system based on common adherence to the gold principle. In effect, gold was the world currency. But that's not true. Gold was not the world currency. The Bank of England was the world currency. The trust in an institution became the world currency, even though it was latched onto gold. So this is a crucial step, in fact, in the evolution of money. The fact that a central institution now assumed the helm or the pooling of trust under its auspices, and it distributed money, it distributed bills written on its prestige, on its trust. So this is a crucial step in the evolution of money, and let us see how this develops subsequently. On page 160, Weatherford writes, under the Bank of England, Britain prospered. With a solid pound sterling, industrialization and trade grew steadily, and prices for most commodities dropped just as steadily throughout the century of peace. So it's not a solid pound sterling. With a solid pound sterling backed by the prestige of the Bank of England, Britain prospered, because people believed that this money is of value, and they were ready to accumulate it, to use it, to change it, to do everything that we do with money with that money. So this institution brought great prosperity. So where Weatherford says that gold provided the underpinning, I would say the prestige of the Bank of England and the belief that gold was of value, and the belief in the Bank of England's notes that they truly represented that value, provided, and continuing with Weatherford, provided the underpinning of that peace and prosperity. Not because of any special quality of gold, yeah, thank you, but simply because the gold standard acted as a huge restraint on governments so long as the country could not print paper money greater than the supply of gold backing it. When asked why gold, one monetary expert reportedly answered, because you can't trust governments, least of all democratic governments. So this was a limitation that created, as we will see later on, some of the great inequalities of the 19th century, which was a great period of prosperity for part of the world and a very miserable period of depredation, of being dispossessed and exploited for the rest of the world. And it all hinged on mining a lot of gold to back this expanding enterprise. So it wasn't really, the system had not yet become liberated to sufficiently abstract to serve all the people, all the nations, everywhere. It was more skewed to the British Empire. But within the British Empire, we see that that this trust in the institution gave rise to amazing prosperity. While still being restricted, this was in fact the first intimation that this centrality of an institution can in fact serve as the foundation of the entire economy. But this was hidden, this was like a subtext, because the overt text was that everything has to be connected to gold. And we will see how this collapses because there's not enough gold. And a good growing economy needs money all the time to expand and to grow, to allow people to express their creativity through being paid for it. So you need a lot of money in an economy. The amount of money in an economy must fit the ability of an economy to expand in order to truly support creativity. So since gold was limited in amount, it ultimately strangulated the economies that were continuing to develop. In fact, we've already seen this strangulation of the economy because of the demand for metals when we spoke last time about the suggestions of Benjamin Franklin and how the American War of Independence was fought with bills not covered sufficiently by gold at that time. But that experiment ended in a bit of misery, we saw, because the paper money lost its credibility. People were still looking for the gold. So they distrusted the money, and that distrust grew until the money lost all value. And indeed, we should at some later point try to understand how this happens. When this newly minted note goes out, are notes minted? No, I think only coins are minted. This newly printed note goes out of the printing press. When the whole system begins operating, then it is equal to the gold that it's supposed to represent. But we see that as time goes, it becomes devalued. until ultimately it can lose all of its value. People no longer think it represents value. How does this come about? When does the distrust settle in? When does it develop? How does it develop? How does the distrust spread? Who are the people still willing to accept, say, in the War of Independence in America, still willing to accept Confederate dollars? Who are they? When do they stop accepting? Who are the first initiators of distrust who do not agree to accept this paper money? They want the gold, and so on. So gold, this attachment to tangibles was in fact a suffocating, a debilitating aspect of the market. And in the evolution of money, we will see that every time that this tendency to always look for the collateral, the hard coin, is always a tendency that undermines the market, undermines the ability of money to actually mediate all human creativity. So going back to Weatherford, I'm reading a bit about a gold discipline. It's on page 162. And Weatherford writes that throughout the 19th century, the European governments found themselves severely limited by the gold system around them. Unable to give away lands and make grants as earlier monarchs had done, and unable to print endless amount of money, the governments needed to find new ways to enrich themselves. If gold was the ultimate valuable behind the currency, then to make more money, they needed more gold. This need for gold set off the greatest international scramble since the conquest of America in the 16th century. So everything was growing, expanding. Humanity was coming into its own. Huge new enterprises beginning to flourish. And because they were still hooked on the gold, because nobody wanted to trust money as embodied trust in itself. They needed something to hang it on. That became the great gold rush, the great avarice for gold. And a lot of blood was spilled over this. Okay, there's a lot of interesting stuff here in Weatherford. I recommend reading this chapter in full, but I'm still giving you the highlights. So on page 164, Weatherford writes that, so now Weatherford offers us some political analysis. He's describing how in fact, the military might of the nations eventually came about to the First World War. He writes that in the process of conquering the inhabited continents and making them into colonies, the European powers created massive standing armies, navies, and the industrial and organizational structures needed to support them. With these enormous military resources available and virtually no new lands to conquer, they fell upon one another in the First World War, the greatest bloodbath known up to that time. So, okay, you can accept or not accept this analysis of why the First World War happens. It's like there's an old Heinlein book called Have Spacesuit Will Travel. So, okay, so have army will fight. Maybe it's logical, but what is of importance to us here is what happened to the money, because this is a crucial part. As usual, war plays a crucial part in the evolution of money. Unfortunately, certain things in the evolution of mankind come to a sort of cul-de-sac, a sort of dead end, and only war breaks open the deadlock. And where money is concerned, we see that every time war forced people to trust each other and expand their money economy based on that trust. And here, with the outbreak of war, writes Weatherford, the governments of Europe had an excuse to take over management of their own economies, to expand the internal power of the government over all sectors of public life, to impose taxes such as income tax in the United States. If they lacked the gold to finance their new undertakings, then in the name of patriotism and war emergency, they simply printed the money anyway and took the country off the gold standard. As long as a country stayed on the gold standard, it limited the amount of money in circulation and thereby limited the amount of money that the government could borrow. If the people lacked the money to buy government bonds, then the government had only its tax revenues to spend. So we see that war, you've no gold, but you have to carry out the war, so you print the money. And you discover that that's fine. It's like the Faustian legend that we began this talk with. It works like magic, and especially when patriotism is at stake, because war unites people on other levels, on all the levels that we are pre-wired for, as we saw in our discussion of the righteous mind. So this is an evolutionary basis for trust, for binding people together, because we are as one, we trust each other that we will fight together against the common enemy. And this trust becomes embodied in paper money. People believe in that money because it is our money and we are going together to defeat the enemy. So nobody is going to bite the coin now. Nobody is going to say, no, I'm not accepting the money, I'm shutting down the plant. People are willing even to work for free just to make the weapons to fight the enemy. So money is easily accepted in war, even when it is not tied to more tangible aspects. And the First World War gave that push in the evolution of money towards greater and greater abstraction. And we see here other elements that come in, the taxing of income. And again, if it's all on paper, then what is that income? That is what people exchange value to each other, and some of it the government takes to itself. So if you exchange value with a person, say you pay someone 100 pounds, the government takes a part of that 100, like 30 pounds or 40 pounds or 50 pounds, depending on the government, or depending on the way that this is divided. But in any case, these values grow into greater and greater circles of faith, circles of trust, as people exchange money not just with themselves but with the government, and the government gives back that money, and it's all in paper, because in a war, okay, so we don't have enough gold, but we need to move forward. And everything moves forward very smoothly, even without gold to back you. Then Weatherford writes that the autonomy of the Bank of England, already chiseled away by repeated government assaults, ended with the First World War. We now see the shift to money backed by government, where before the Bank of England backed the money with gold. It had gold in its coffers and it issued the bills. Now the government took over the Bank of England, and now instead of the authority of the bank, which was very intimately tied with the gold, the authority of the government became the central point on which the value of money was now hinged. And the need of the British government to finance its army once again took precedence over the discipline of the gold standard, and the bank printed far more money than it could convert into gold. Because trust is the issue. Money is accepted. Nobody's going to look for that gold. In fact, all governments are Ponzi schemes. This is really funny. We will analyze Ponzi schemes, and maybe the Madoff scam, and we'll see how close it is, how similar are Ponzi schemes to the actual work of governments. In effect, pouring trust into the economy. And once the government, writes Weatherford, once the government has seen how easy it was to get money without the discipline of the gold standard, it was reluctant to return to the restraints of that yoke. After the war, there was a brief attempt to return to the gold standard, but in 1931, Britain permanently dropped any pretense of tying the value of its currency to its deposits of gold. The era of gold and the heyday of the Bank of England had ended. So we see that the First World War, in fact, ended this illusion of actual tangible connection between gold and money. It had always been an illusion, but much of the trust of the public in money had to hinge on that illusion of there being gold. Everybody believed it. This was what constrained governments from printing money. Now that the reins were loosed, now that all governments could print money, we will see that this led to great abuses because they didn't know yet. In the evolution of money, we are now on the verge of the great disruptions, the great eruptions caused by the expansion of trust into what we call bubbles. And ultimately, the Great Depression is now looming on the horizon, and that Great Depression was caused by loss of trust in money. And when that trust will be regained, it will be through the strength of governments, the strength of nations, the relocation of the center of trust from what was before the gold into the institutions themselves that now backed their bills, their money, and this is part of the transition. But at first, when going off the gold standard, it all seemed very ephemeral. It seemed that, in fact, things have become quite detached from the actual collateral. Everything seemed up in the air. And no matter that it was always up in the air. And even today, there are many economists and many critiques of the economy that keep harking back to the days of the gold or to the days of the hard currency, the hard commodities, as if those commodities, these underlying commodities, reflect the true value of a money economy rather than the actual value which resides in the trust and belief of people in that value. And so, after the First World War, in fact, the war itself had led to a tremendous expansion of the economy and economies of the combating nations in the war. And these economies relied on money printed by governments, paper money, carrying, in fact, distributing the trust in the central government among the population, and thus serving as currency, and finally becoming detached from the underlying materiality of gold. But in fact, this was a process. It's not finished yet. In the next talk, we will discuss the Great Depression, how it came about, what happened to these economies that suddenly found themselves floating on a sea of printed money, what steps were taken, and how this continued to change because the connection somewhere with gold was still operating somewhere in the background. It was no longer a gold standard, but gold was somewhere there all the time, hovering as a kind of the ultimate collateral, the ultimate biteable material substance that could still be used to hinge trust on. And this, but after the First World War, it was already completely detached from the actual process of money, from the actual way in which money behaved. And as we will discuss in the next talk, we will see how money continued to evolve, continued to become more and more abstract, more and more dependent on inter-subjective trust, as embodied mostly in trust of government. in trust of the institutions of the nation, which are embedded in the minds of people on many levels, such as nationality, patriotism, trust in the legal system, a feeling of togetherness. We are one nation and so on, which also has many implications for trust and for the way we perceive others. The famous Anderson book about imagined communities and so on. This will be another separate talk about nationalism, how we connect with others in perceiving them as like us, as belonging to the same nation, speaking the same language, united in the same under the same institutions, and obviously this is a point of contention in all the entire political world. Everywhere, in every nation, there are struggles over what defines the nation, what brings us together. And now this national substructure becomes the substructure on which the trust in money relies, and the central focus of trust. But again, this is a process of evolution. We have to take a look at one of the greatest economic catastrophes of the 20th century, between the two world wars, the Great Depression, which decimated so much of the great advancements of the economy in the West, and paved the way to so much knowledge acquired through so much pain about the way markets behave and how fragile they are to the disruptions of trust, to distrust, to panic, to anxieties, and so on. And as we will see in further additional economic texts that we will look at, we see these words repeat themselves. Anxiety, panic, the market is jittery, the market is fearful. All these words that seem so out of place when we are talking about, seemingly talking about material things, but quite explicable, since we are in fact dealing with the world of trust and distrust, belief and doubt, and money is the tangible manifestation of that trust. As we said, manifestation of trust. Okay, so you're invited to join me in the next talk.